Has any medical researcher actually considered what killed Queen Anne's children? Because when you look at the comments on every video about her, hundreds of them, one theory keeps surfacing. Nurses post it, medical students post it. People who clearly know more about obstetrics than most history content creators keep saying the same thing. RH incompatibility. And here's what's frustrating. The videos about Queen Anne spend 20 minutes on court drama. Sarah Churchill this, political intrigue that. Then they get to the part where she lost 17 pregnancies, and suddenly the narrator drops into that somber voice. Tragically, none of her children survived. And then we're moving on. 30 seconds of medicine, maximum. So we're going to flip that ratio. We're treating this as what it actually is, an unsolved medical cold case. And the primary suspect is a condition that Anne's doctors couldn't possibly have diagnosed because the science wouldn't exist for another 250 years. Let's investigate. First, you need to understand what RH incompatibility actually is. Not the simplified version, but the full biological mechanism. Because when you understand exactly how this works at the cellular level, Anne's heartbreaking history starts making a terrible kind of sense. In 1940, more than 2 centuries after Anne's death, 2 scientists named Carl Landsteiner and Alexander Wiener identified something they called the rhesus factor. Named after the monkeys they used in their experiments, it's a protein that either exists on the surface of your red blood cells or it doesn't. If you have it, you're Rh positive. If you don't, you're Rh negative. About 85% of people are Rh positive. The remaining 15% are Rh negative. For most of your life, this distinction means absolutely nothing. Your Rh status doesn't affect your health, doesn't affect your energy. You could live 90 years without ever knowing or caring what your Rh factor is. Except during pregnancy. Here's where everything goes wrong. And I mean everything. If the mother is Rh negative and the father is Rh positive, there's a significant chance their baby will inherit the father's Rh positive blood type. During a healthy pregnancy, the mother's blood and the baby's blood stay mostly separate, divided by the placental barrier. But during delivery, especially the chaotic, sometimes traumatic births of the 17th century, the 2 blood supplies can mix. Fetal blood cells enter the mother's bloodstream, and this is where her immune system makes a catastrophic mistake. Her body identifies those Rh-positive cells as foreign invaders, dangerous intruders that must be destroyed. So it starts producing antibodies against the Rh factor, essentially creating a biological weapon, a weapon targeted at any future Rh-positive baby she might carry. But here's the crucial detail that explains why first pregnancies usually survive, and why the pattern of losses follows such a predictable trajectory. The immune system doesn't immediately produce the dangerous antibodies. When it first encounters the Rh-positive cells, it produces a type of antibody called ImG. These ImG antibodies are large molecules, bulky, too big to cross the placental barrier, so even if sensitization begins during a first pregnancy, those early antibodies can't reach the baby. They're locked on the mother's side of the placenta, unable to cause harm. But the immune system learns. It adapts. Over time, usually after that first delivery when significant blood mixing occurs, the body switches to producing IgG antibodies. These are smaller, more refined, and critically, they can cross the placenta easily. They slip through the barrier like water through a sieve. By the second pregnancy, if that baby is Rh positive, the IgG antibodies are waiting. They've been circulating in the mother's blood since the last pregnancy, and they immediately begin crossing into fetal circulation. They coat the baby's red blood cells, marking them for destruction. The mathematics of this condition are cruel. Each sensitization event, each pregnancy where fetal blood mixes with maternal blood, triggers the production of more antibodies. The immune response becomes more aggressive, more efficient. What started as a trickle becomes a flood. By the 5th or 6th Rh-positive pregnancy, The antibody levels can be astronomical. The immune system has essentially been training for this fight, getting stronger each time. This is why the pattern is so recognizable in retrospect. A woman might have one healthy child, maybe two, then a miscarriage, then a stillbirth, then babies who are born alive but survive only hours or days. The later pregnancies are almost always worse than the earlier ones. The immune system remembers, and it gets better at killing. Now let me explain what actually happens to the baby, because this is the part that makes Rh disease so devastating and so recognizable even in historical records. When IgG antibodies cross the placenta and attach to fetal red blood cells, they mark those cells for destruction. The baby's spleen, the organ responsible for filtering damaged blood cells, goes into overdrive trying to remove them. Red blood cells are being destroyed faster than the baby's body can replace them. This destruction is called hemolysis. The baby becomes profoundly anemic. Not enough red blood cells to carry oxygen. Not enough to sustain normal development. But the body tries to compensate. The liver kicks into emergency production mode, trying to manufacture new red blood cells outside the bone marrow, something it normally only does in early fetal development. The spleen enlarges massively, working overtime to filter the damaged cells. Both organs become swollen, sometimes grotesquely so, and then the cascade really begins. The destruction of red blood cells releases hemoglobin into the bloodstream. The liver has to process this hemoglobin, breaking it down into a waste product called bilirubin. But the fetal liver is immature. It can't handle the volume. Bilirubin begins to accumulate. This is what causes the characteristic jaundice, that deep yellowing of the skin and eyes that would have been visible to any 17th century physician, even if they had no idea what caused it. In severe cases, bilirubin crosses into the brain, a condition called kernicterus. It deposits in brain tissue, causing permanent neurological damage, seizures, hearing loss, cerebral palsy. In the worst cases, death. But there's another mechanism happening simultaneously. The liver, overwhelmed and enlarged, begins to fail at its other critical functions. One of those functions is producing a protein called albumin. Albumin is what keeps fluid inside blood vessels. It creates what's called oncotic pressure. Without enough albumin, fluid leaks out of the bloodstream and into tissues. The baby begins to swell. Fluid accumulates in the abdomen, in the chest cavity, around the heart, under the skin. This condition is called hydrops fetalis, and it is almost always fatal without modern intervention. A baby with hydrops is visibly, dramatically swollen, born looking almost unrecognizable. The fluid compresses the lungs, making breathing impossible. It restricts the heart, preventing it from pumping effectively. This is what Anne's doctors would have seen. Babies born yellow and swollen. Babies who gasped for breath and died within hours. Babies who were stillborn, their bodies already damaged beyond survival. They had no framework to understand it, no vocabulary for it, but they documented what they saw. Now, let me apply this framework to Anne's actual history. All 17 pregnancies. Anne married Prince George of Denmark on July 28, 1683. She was 18 years old. By all contemporary accounts, theirs was a genuine love match, a rarity among royal marriages of that era. George was described by contemporaries as dull, dim, and unambitious. Charles II supposedly said of him, "I have tried him drunk, and I have tried him sober, and there is nothing in him." But he was kind to Anne, gentle, devoted, and she loved him in a way that seems to have surprised everyone at court. Within a year of their marriage, Anne was pregnant for the first time. On May 12, 1684, Anne delivered a stillborn daughter. This first loss doesn't perfectly fit the Rh model. which typically allows the first pregnancy to succeed. Those IMG antibodies shouldn't have been able to cross the placenta yet. But medicine rarely presents perfectly clean patterns. Maybe this stillbirth had another cause entirely: infection, cord accident, simple developmental abnormality. Maybe there was some earlier sensitization event we don't know about. What matters is what came next. June 1685. Anne gave birth to a daughter named Mary. She was healthy. She thrived. For the first time, Anne was a mother. May 1686. A second daughter, Anne Sophia, also healthy at birth. For a brief, shining moment, Anne had 2 living children, 2 daughters, an heir and a spare. Then winter 1687 arrived. Both girls fell ill with smallpox. The disease swept through the household like fire. Anne Sophia died on February 2, 1687. She was roughly 9 months old. Perhaps she had been weaker from birth. Perhaps those first antibodies had done some subtle damage after all. We can't know. 6 days later, on February 8, 1687, Mary followed her sister. Anne had gone from mother of 2 to childless in less than a week. She was barely 22 years old, and the cruelty of the timing, losing both children to an infectious disease, not the mysterious wasting that would claim so many future pregnancies, must have seemed like pure malice from the universe. But the Rh sensitization would have been progressing silently. Each pregnancy, each delivery, pumping more antibodies into Anne's bloodstream. The immune system learning, preparing. The losses continued in a relentless cascade. January 1687, around the same time her daughters were dying of smallpox, miscarriage. Her body was already pregnant again, already failing. October 1687, a stillborn son. April 1688, another miscarriage. Notice the pattern emerging? She had successfully carried 2 pregnancies to term, Mary and Anne Sophia, and watched those children live for months, nearly years. Now she couldn't carry a pregnancy past the first trimester. The losses came earlier, more frequently, more completely. Then came William. On July 24, 1689, Anne gave birth to a son, William Henry. He would be created Duke of Gloucester. He was sickly from the beginning. His head was noticeably large. Water on the brain, the physicians called it, which we now recognize as hydrocephalus. His development was delayed. He didn't walk until he was nearly 5 years old. He was prone to fevers, to illness, to weakness. But he survived, day after day, month after month, year after year, against all odds and all precedent, against the pattern that had claimed every other pregnancy since Mary and Anne Sophia. William lived. Now this seems like a paradox for the Rh incompatibility theory. If Anne's antibodies were destroying her babies, why did William survive? But it's actually consistent with the genetics involved. If Prince George was heterozygous for the Rh factor, meaning he carried one Rh positive gene and one Rh negative gene, then each child would have had roughly a 50% chance of inheriting the Rh negative gene from him. William may simply have inherited his mother's blood type, Rh negative. Invisible to the antibodies, they weren't looking for him. His hydrocephalus, his developmental delays, his chronic weakness, these likely had separate causes. Perhaps related to the difficult circumstances of Anne's pregnancy, her body already battered from years of losses. Perhaps complications during delivery. Perhaps simply the random chance of developmental abnormality that happens regardless of blood type. But William was Rh negative. That's why he survived when the others didn't. The losses continued alongside his survival. October 16th, 90. Another daughter, another Mary, named for the sister who had died. This Mary lived exactly 2 hours. April 16th, 92. A son named George, after his father. He survived only minutes after birth. Perhaps he breathed. Perhaps he opened his eyes. Then he was gone. Then came the miscarriages. Pregnancy after pregnancy ending before the babies could even be born alive, before they could demonstrate the jaundice and swelling that would have marked them as victims of Rh disease. March 16, 93. January 16, 94. February 16, 95. September 16, 96. Anne was pregnant with twins. She lost them both before they could be born. March 16, 97. December 16, 97. September 16, 98. Can you imagine it? The hope each time, the fear, the physical toll of pregnancy on a body already exhausted, already grieving, already marked by chronic illness. And then, each time, the loss. January 1700. Anne delivered a stillborn son, her final pregnancy. She was 34 years old and had been pregnant almost continuously for 16 years. Through all of this, William lived, her one surviving child, the heir to the throne. Everything focused on this one sickly, hydrocephalic boy who struggled to walk and suffered constant fevers. His 11th birthday was celebrated on July 24th, 1700, with all the ceremony appropriate for the only surviving child of the future queen. There were festivities, excitement, perhaps too much excitement. William developed a fever soon after. On July 30th, 1700, 6 days after turning 11, William, Duke of Gloucester, died. The cause was almost certainly related to his chronic hydrocephalus, the increased pressure in his skull perhaps triggered or worsened by the fever. Some historians have suggested scarlet fever. Others blame the strain of the birthday celebrations on an already fragile constitution. It doesn't really matter what killed him. What matters is that Anne had outlived every one of her children. 17 pregnancies over 17 years of marriage. At the end, nothing. No heir. No surviving child to comfort her in her grief or continue her line. If you've experienced even one loss, you understand why this matters. One miscarriage can reshape your entire understanding of your body, your future, your relationship with hope itself. Anne experienced 17 pregnancies and buried every single child. This isn't abstract history. This was a woman's body and heart breaking, over and over, for nearly 2 decades. Here's what most documentaries get catastrophically wrong about Queen Anne. They frame her as a victim of her reproductive failures, a tragic figure defined by what she lost. But this framing obscures something remarkable. Anne survived 17 pregnancies. Let that sink in for a moment. In late 17th century England, somewhere between 1% and 2% of births resulted in the mother's death. That sounds small until you do the math. A woman facing a 2% mortality rate with each pregnancy, who goes through 17 pregnancies, faces a cumulative risk of dying that approaches 30%. 1 in 3 women with Anne's obstetric history would not have survived it. Anne beat those odds. Childbirth in this era was dangerous in ways that are difficult for modern audiences to fully appreciate. There were no antiseptic procedures, no understanding of germ theory. That wouldn't come for another 150 years. No antibiotics for the infections that killed so many new mothers. Childbed fever, puerperal fever, caused by bacterial infection of the reproductive tract, was a leading killer of women who survived delivery itself. The bacteria entered through unwashed hands, contaminated instruments, dirty bedding. It caused fever, chills, agonizing abdominal pain, and death within days. Hemorrhaging, obstructed labor, eclampsia, seizures caused by pregnancy-related high blood pressure. All these complications existed, and physicians had almost no effective tools to address them. The royal physicians attending Anne were the best in England, but the best, in 1690, still meant men who didn't wash their hands between examining patients, men who had no conception of bacteria or viruses, men who might bleed you to balance your humors while you were already dying from blood loss. When we reframe Anne's story this way, she transforms from pitiable victim to something closer to endurance athlete. She kept going. After the first stillbirth, she got pregnant again. After the double blow of losing Mary and Anne Sophia to smallpox within a single week, she got pregnant again. After miscarriage, after miscarriage, after miscarriage, she got pregnant again. 17 times, she risked her life for the chance to bear a living child. 14 times, after losing the girls to smallpox, she allowed herself to hope again. This isn't weakness. This is a form of courage that deserves recognition. To understand Anne's life fully, you also need to understand pain, not as an abstract concept, as a daily physical reality that shaped everything she experienced. Anne suffered from gout. If you've never experienced gout, it's worth understanding what that actually meant. Gout occurs when uric acid accumulates in the bloodstream and forms crystals in the joints. These crystals are sharp, needle-like structures that trigger intense inflammation. The affected joint, most commonly the big toe, but gout can strike ankles, knees, wrists, becomes swollen, red, hot to the touch, and exquisitely painful. People who have experienced gout describe the pain in terms that approach the limits of language, like having your foot set on fire, like walking on broken glass, like a hot poker being driven through your flesh, like slamming your hand in a car door, except the pain doesn't fade. It builds and persists for days, sometimes weeks. The phrase that appears again and again in gout sufferers' descriptions, even the weight of a bedsheet on the affected joint is unbearable. Imagine experiencing that pain regularly, for weeks at a time, while also being pregnant, while grieving, while running a country, while maintaining the elaborate social performance required of a queen. This was Anne's reality. Her gout appears to have begun in her late 20s and progressively worsened over time. By the final years of her reign, Anne could barely walk. She was carried through the palace in a specially designed chair, part wheelchair, part sedan chair. At her coronation in 1702, she had to be carried to Westminster Abbey. State occasions requiring her to stand were exercises in raw endurance, and contemporaries noted her obvious physical distress. Anne was also notably heavy. Her diet, like that of most aristocrats of her era, was rich in the purines that exacerbate gout: red meat, organ meats, alcohol, rich sauces. Modern medicine recognizes that gout often clusters with other metabolic problems: obesity, diabetes, insulin resistance. Whether these conditions contributed to her pregnancy losses, perhaps through inflammatory processes, we can't know for certain. But Anne's body was fighting battles on multiple fronts. Now, a thorough investigation requires considering alternative explanations. Intellectual honesty demands it. Rh incompatibility isn't the only condition that causes recurrent pregnancy loss. Lupus and other autoimmune conditions have been proposed. Systemic lupus erythematosus can cause recurrent miscarriage through several mechanisms, including antibodies that attack the placenta or cause blood clots restricting fetal blood supply. Anne's chronic inflammation, her multiple health problems, might be consistent with autoimmune disease. But lupus doesn't typically produce the particular pattern of worsening losses with successive pregnancies that characterizes Rh disease. Lupus losses tend to occur more randomly throughout a woman's reproductive history. Antiphospholipid syndrome, sometimes called Hughes syndrome, is another strong candidate. This condition involves antibodies that increase the tendency for blood clots to form. It's a well-recognized cause of recurrent pregnancy loss. Blood clots in the placenta can cause miscarriage, stillbirth, or preterm delivery. But antiphospholipid syndrome tends to cause losses at various stages throughout pregnancy, not specifically the progressive worsening pattern we see in Anne's history. Early pregnancies with some survival, later pregnancies failing earlier and more consistently. Genetic factors can't be ruled out entirely. Anne and George were both members of heavily intermarried royal families. The Stuarts had married back into the same bloodlines for generations. Chromosomal abnormalities, inherited conditions that cause fetal abnormality, these could explain some losses. But genetic causes would typically show a more consistent pattern of loss type and timing, rather than the progressive worsening we see here. Genetic problems don't get worse with each pregnancy, the way immunological sensitization does. When you weigh all the evidence, the pattern of worsening outcomes, the characteristic timeline of losses, the one surviving child who may have inherited his mother's blood type, the late pregnancy stillbirths, and early infant deaths, Rh incompatibility remains the strongest single explanation. Which brings us to what makes this truly heartbreaking. Not just that Anne lost 17 pregnancies, not just that she endured chronic pain while doing it, not just that she survived when many women wouldn't have. This was preventable. If Anne's doctors had known about Rh incompatibility, if they'd had RhoGAM, most of those losses could have been prevented. A simple injection during pregnancy and after delivery. That's all it would have taken. In 1968, RhoGAM became widely available. It's an injection of Rh immunoglobulin given to Rh-negative mothers around the 28th week of pregnancy, and again within 72 hours after delivery. These injected antibodies find any fetal Rh-positive cells that have entered the mother's bloodstream and clear them out before her own immune system can detect them. The sensitization never happens. The biological weapons are never manufactured. Subsequent pregnancies proceed normally. Today, Rh incompatibility is almost entirely preventable. The technology is so mundane, so routine, that most Rh-negative mothers barely think about it. They get a shot at their prenatal appointment, another after delivery. They go home. They carry healthy pregnancies. Their babies are born without jaundice, without swelling, without the cellular warfare that killed Anne's children. Anne's doctors couldn't have known. Blood types wouldn't be discovered until 1901. The Rh factor wouldn't be identified until 1940. RhoGAM wouldn't exist until 1968. Every tool we now have to prevent this tragedy was centuries away from being developed. A brief note on the political implications. Anne needed a Protestant heir. The Act of Settlement of 1701 had already determined that if Anne died without children, the crown would pass to the Protestant descendants of Sophia of Hanover, distant relatives, but the closest ones who weren't Catholic. When Anne died in 1714, having outlived every one of her children, George Louis of Hanover became King George I, an entire dynasty. The Hanoverians, eventually becoming the Windsors, exists in part because of what may have been Rh incompatibility. But that's political history. Other videos have covered it endlessly. The point is that a woman experienced 17 pregnancies, lost every child, endured pain that most of us can barely imagine, survived against the odds when she easily might not have, and for 300 years, historians focused on court intrigue while the medical mystery sat there, obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. The comments on those other videos were right. Rh incompatibility explains the pattern. The first pregnancies with more variability before the antibody response fully developed. The progressively worsening outcomes as sensitization increased. The one survivor who might have been Rh negative like his mother. The late pregnancy stillbirths and early infant deaths as the immune response became overwhelming. Anne's doctors couldn't have known. The science simply didn't exist. But we can know now. We can look at her history with modern eyes and finally understand what she was fighting against. Not weakness of character, not divine punishment, not the vague tragedy that documentaries mention and then rush past. A protein on the surface of blood cells, a mismatch between mother and father, an immune system doing exactly what immune systems are designed to do, identifying foreign cells and destroying them, with devastating consequences when those foreign cells are your own children. The tragedy isn't just that it happened. The tragedy is that it's so simple, so preventable, so utterly mundane by modern standards. A shot, that's all. One shot, and most of those 17 pregnancies could have ended differently. Queen Anne of Great Britain endured 17 pregnancies, outlived every one of her children, ruled a nation while suffering from gout so severe she had to be carried through her own palace, and died at 49 years old, alone, without an heir, her body finally giving out after decades of punishment. The medical mystery isn't really a mystery anymore. Not if you understand immunology, not if you know what to look for. The question is why it took this long for anyone to seriously investigate it. Subscribe for more stories like this.